Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: He Fought the Mob, the Murder of Bobby Fuller. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Murder Most Foul. My guest today is Ron Smith, who has written a marvelous book covering music in the early 60s into 70s, a musical group called the Bobby Fuller Four. But it also had, why it's on my podcast, Murder Most Foul, is it's got a twist. Of course, there's a very sad, well, there's two murders. But the one we're going to, of course, focus on is the murder of Bobby Fuller. So welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So let's, I've been to your website. You've written other books. This isn't a one-off. So what got you onto, was it the murder part, the music part? What sort of attracted you first to the story?
Oh, all of the above, I guess you could say. I grew up in the 60s. Bobby Fuller hit his peak in 1966 when I was 15 years old. And growing up in Texas in that era, local radio was it. And of course, Bobby Fuller was a Texas artist. So living in Houston, where I was, that made him all that much more of a celebrity, if you will. The DJs talked him up quite a bit. As a Texas artist, and but of course his music was great. That's what really drew me to him at the time. But in his death, which we'll discuss here, was unusual enough that even as a 15-year-old kid, I knew something was up with this. There was more to the story than we were being told on the radio, and of course, the story really got very little play on the news. I don't think it ever made the national news whatsoever. and maybe a couple of little blurbs on local LA TV stations where the death occurred. But even, as I said, even as a kid, the murder stuck with me. I never forgot it. I never believed that the ruling of suicide, which is what the police came up with, I never believed that that was an accurate ruling. So it just stuck with me. And then as I began to write here in the last 7 or 8 years, that story again just stayed with me. And I've written several other true crime books, but I began to look into the story of Bobby Fuller and realize that no one had really ever written a book that there were other books that had been written about Bobby and his band. And they did, of course, touch on his death. But everyone seemed to always be afraid of getting into the subject matter of, well, who really killed him? Because as we'll talk about, there were mob connections in there. And I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I think other writers were perhaps afraid to go there. So I'm dumb enough that I went there, and that's where we are.
So I do want to point out for my audience, which I do in every podcast, it's getting a little old, but we cannot cover this story. It's very rich. And the title of the book, He Fought the Mob. And there's a double meaning to that. That's great. Again, we'll cover their great song, I Fought the Law. And so you got to get the book because we can't do the justice. We don't want to get into the weeds. We don't want to have too many names of people. You can do it when you're reading, but if you're listening to something, it's like, wait a minute, who is that? And so we're going to, just the facts, man, we're going to try to keep it to that because I do want to tease people to get the book. So let's wind back to, because again, the band included Bobby and his brother, Randy, and others, but so the two brothers were in it through the whole thing. A couple of people came and went. So let's talk about the two brothers, a little bit about their upbringing.
Their dad, Lawson Fuller, worked in the oil and gas business. Bobby was born very close to where I am. He was born just outside of Houston on the Houston Ship Channel. His dad operated drilling rigs, and shortly after Bobby was born here, the family moved around out to West Texas, and that's where, actually in Hobbs, New Mexico, is where Randy Fuller was born. He was the younger of the two, and Bobby, at a very early age, was a musical prodigy. The family moved around quite a bit. They lived in New Mexico. They moved to Lubbock, Texas, which Lubbock is where Buddy Holly was from. And Bobby was very much influenced by Buddy. And but Bobby was just one of those people that could pick up an instrument and within a matter of days master it. He started on the piano. His mother taught him, but he very quickly advanced beyond anything that she could teach him. He next, in the school band, picked up the cornet and the trumpet. Then they moved to Salt Lake City, where he became a drummer and a very proficient jazz drummer, to the point that he was playing in jazz combos there and being paid for it as a 14, 15-year-old kid. So he was just a marvelous musician and just very talented. It doesn't begin to describe it. His brother Randy always kind of followed in his footsteps. Randy was not nearly the musician that his brother was, but at one point, Randy learned to play the bass guitar. If he wanted to be in Bobby's band, Bobby told him, "You're going to have to learn to play the bass. Even though you know how to play the guitar, I don't want you playing the guitar. I want you to play the bass." So Bobby self-taught himself the Stratocaster, and was, before you knew it, he was giving lessons and giving demonstrations in a music store. It's what Buddy Holly played. And that influenced Bobby to no end. So when he picked up the guitar and taught himself, no lessons, he, within months, was playing lead guitar in the band that he was in El Paso. when the band, Bobby played in a couple of local bands. He started as a drummer because he was, again, one of the most proficient drummers. He won awards. I think I failed to mention that at one point in his career, Lawson Fuller was promoted. He went to work for El Paso Natural Gas Company and was promoted to be their chief drilling operator. So they moved to El Paso, which was where the headquarters were, and that's where Bobby's musical career really flourished. Being there on the border, there were a lot. If you know anything about the border in Juarez and some of those border towns, there was a really thriving musical scene on the other side of the border. In many ways, the musicians there were ahead of the musicians on the other side, the American side of the border. They were much more aggressive in their musical rhythms and their styles, and all of that influenced Bobby and came into play later when he began to write his own music.
Now, I just want to throw in here, I got my notes here, and it's some of the things from the book that I just went, what? But his mother, now again, when you talk about the level of his father's job, so clearly they weren't, poor people monetarily, she was thinking about Juilliard.
While they were living in Salt Lake City, his high school instructor was so enamored with him and so impressed by him that he arranged for him to audition and was accepted. It was his mother who did not want him to go so far away. So she really wasn't going to allow him to go away that far. Again, he was, I think, 14 years old when the Juilliard offer came along.
And as you say, I think we do this is a good place to connect, that he was a big Buddy Holly fan. And we'll give a little history of Buddy Holly, as we go through it, is that, again, he's another one of these tragic figures where he was killed in a plane crash. But we know, with a little research, I looked back up Buddy Holly, I seem to remember this from the past, that it was a small plane and someone gave up their seat, said, well, I'll take another plane. And we'll tell who that person was. And he gave up his seat. So the plane was full. Everyone in it, including the pilot, was killed. But we'll talk about that. But so again, right from the beginning, Buddy Holly was he was very big. He was certainly bigger than these guys.
Well, Bobby's career really began in El Paso. He actually created a home recording studio in his family's home. His parents allowed him to cut a hole in the wall between the garage and the living room, and the garage served as the control booth, so they could look into the living room while the band was playing. But it was a 4-piece combo: rhythm guitar, lead guitar, drums, and bass. And the original drummer, was a fellow named Dalton Powell, who is still alive. He lives in El Paso, and I interviewed him for this book. He was quite helpful. The guitarist was a fellow named Jim Reese, who was with the band from the beginning. Now, while they were in El Paso, you've got to remember they were a local garage band almost, and these guys had real jobs, and sometimes they would have to come and go as far as being members of the band. But those 4 individuals, Randy Fuller, Bobby, Dalton Powell, and Jim Reese, were really the nucleus of the band until they went to California.
And so they're reaching. Tell my audience when we get into the song that made them, launched them into national, and unfortunately problematic too, because we'll talk about the mob, we'll talk about, none of that would have happened if they didn't have any juice. But because they had juice, that they were easy pickings for these people. And we also want to get into it. So, when you want to do it, it looks like they had one kind of, maybe some ancillaries, but one kind of manager / whatever, Bob Keane. And so tell us about the genesis of the song, which catapulted them. There's no question. They were on Billboard 100 to the top 10. I think they made it to 9. Yeah. That's not slouch. That's not garage band. That's you're out there. So tell us about the song again. Once again, I Fought the Law. So how did that come to be that they got to cover it or do it? Technically, I don't think it was already recorded at that point. Is that correct?
No, it had been recorded. It never went anywhere. The story of I Fought the Law, again, Bobby had his own home recording studio and had released, I believe, probably 7 or 8 records locally. He tried very hard to expand the scope of the range of his music to get into markets that were further away. But living in El Paso, Texas in the early 60s, that was difficult to do. He almost had to physically drive to radio stations all over the West Texas and New Mexico region, deliver his record and ask people to play it. So, which he did very successfully. But again, he was really nothing more than a local artist at that point. Because he was such a Bobby Fuller fan, he was such a Buddy Holly fan, he listened to everything that Buddy had ever learned, and as his bandmates mentioned in the book, they played every Buddy Holly song in their live repertoire when they played clubs there in El Paso. But there was one song that his brother Randy took note of, and it actually was recorded by the Crickets, not Buddy Holly, because Buddy Holly was killed in the plane crash in 1959. And it was, I believe, 1961 that the Crickets had formed with a new lead singer named Sonny Curtis. Sonny Curtis went on to be famous. He recorded and sang the introduction to the Mary Tyler Moore TV show.
Who can turn the world off with her smile? Who can take a nothing day and suddenly make it all seem worthwhile? Well, it's you, girl, and you should know it. For these glance and every little move that you show it. Love is going around, no need to waste it. You think now the town, why don't you take it? You're gonna make it after all.
He wrote songs for the Everly Brothers. He was quite a successful songwriter. He wrote the song, I Fought the Law, and the Crickets recorded it on one of their albums in, as I said, 61. And they only released it as the B-side of one of their singles. They never really saw much juice in the song or any future in it. So they made it a B-side, and again, it went nowhere. However, being the Buddy Holly fans that they were, Randy and his brother Bobby listened to the record that the Crickets had released, and Randy saw some life in that song, and he said, hey, I think if we recorded this and rocked it up a little bit more, I think it could be a hit. So that is the story of how I Fought the Law came to be recorded by the Bobby Fuller Four. Of course, at that time, they weren't even called the Bobby Fuller Four. They were called the Fanatics. And the name came to be an issue when they moved out to California. But the song was recorded in Bobby's home studio there in his family's house in El Paso. It became a local hit, a big local hit. But again, it never went anywhere beyond the West Texas area. Nobody in California or New York or anywhere heard of this record. So Bobby had the itch to move to California. He wanted to get a recording contract. He was a very ambitious fellow, as you can tell by having his own recording studio and writing a lot of his own music. He was just a very, not only creative, but inventive guy. So he said to his brother, I want to go to California. Let's see if we can get a recording deal. So based on the success of some of the local records, they went out to California. They got a residency playing at a club on the beach in Hermosa Beach, California. But they hit every record label in Hollywood. They went up and down the streets with their little reels of tape, and they really never got anywhere because they were very amateurish about it at that point. They had no agent. They had no manager. It was just the two brothers going up and down the street in Hollywood on Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset and, saying, hey, would you please listen to our tapes? They got no traction with any of the major labels, but there was one fellow named Bob Keane who had his own record label called Delphi Records. And Bob Keane had had some success in the past with Richie Valens, and Bob Keane's label was one of the first to innovate with the recording of surf music around 1960. He had a lot of famous people come and go through his studio. He had a real head for talent. He wasn't the greatest businessman in the world, but he, at various points, had Frank Zappa come through his studio and work there. David Gates, who later became with Bread, Bruce Johnston, who later became one of the Beach Boys. All these guys came through Delphi Studios and recorded there and worked with Bob Keane. But when Bobby Fuller and Randy Fuller knocked on the door, and Keane was one of the few who actually listened to their tapes. And he said, "Hey, listen, guys, your music is good, but I don't hear anything here that's, got even the hint of being a hit record. Why don't you go back home to El Paso, hone your skills a little bit more, work on writing your own music, and improve your professionalism as a stage act, and then come back and see me, and I'll see what you got then." So they were not disappointed by that. For once, they had actually had a record label listen to them and give them some advice, and Bobby said, essentially, "Yes, sir, Mr. Keane, we'll do all of that." They went back to El Paso for almost a year, and it was in that period they would turn to El Paso when I Fought the Law became the hit record that it was. That's when they returned to Hollywood with the band, the members that I mentioned earlier by name, and they were still hoping to get on perhaps with a bigger label than Delphi Records, because Delphi had nothing going for it at that point. Richie Valens had passed on in the same plane crash with Buddy Holly. Surf music was a big thing at that point, but Delphi had no big surf artist. So it was a matter of good timing that the Fuller brothers went back, knocked on the door. They played some new music, including I Fought the Law. And in that year away, that hiatus, they'd gone back to El Paso. Bobby had become much better at writing his own music. Long story short, Bob Keane liked what he heard this time around, signed them to a deal, and they became Delphi recording artists.
Now, this is a side question that you may not know the answer to. You're talking about tapes and that, and going to radio stations. Did they press, or not physically themselves, but did they press like single records of stuff they did? How much would that cost? I mean, you go to some place, you're going to print 5 records, or, was it cheap? Not cheap, but affordable to go to, I don't know where you go, some electronic place, and they pour vinyl and they cut your record, or what?
Well, in El Paso, there was no real pressing plant for records, but yeah, Bobby, he usually would press 100 or a couple of hundred singles, 45s, and he had to go to Alamogordo, New Mexico to have them pressed. There was a recording studio in Alamogordo, that was also adjacent to a radio station there. And the radio station owner would record artists and press records for them. I have no idea how much it cost, but I don't think it was very expensive. But also, Bobby came from a family where his parents humored him with a lot of the thing. Again, if you can only imagine parents allowing a recording studio to be set up in their living room, it shows how much they indulged Bobby's love of the record business, and I'm sure that they helped pay for pressing a lot of the records that he did there locally in El Paso.
Now, and we're going to eventually soon be coming to the dark side of the story, but even before things sort of were, first, obviously, it was going well, or they thought they would. And then, of course, it was clear that they were being taken advantage of. But before the death of Bobby, there was his half-brother. I believe that was the relationship was murdered.
Yeah, while they were living in El Paso, they had a tragedy that befell the family. Bobby's mother had been married previously, and she had a son from that marriage who was approximately 10 years older than Bobby. And he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. bounced around from job to job. I think he had a drinking problem. He and Mr. Fuller did not get along very well mostly because I think it was stepfather, stepson kind of relationship issues there. Anyway, the brother's name was Jack, and he traveled around, would show up unannounced at times to the family home there, and when the family had settled in El Paso, Jack showed up one day and decided that he wanted to be close to his stepbrothers and his mom. So he ended up taking a job there in El Paso and disappeared one day, just didn't show up for work. His mother had a premonition that something bad had happened even before she knew that he had gone missing from his job. And she worried all day, and the family tried to calm her down and say, he'll show up. He always does. He's probably gone over to Juarez and gotten drunk, but, he always comes back. Well, this time he didn't come back, and he was missing for a couple of weeks before a man was found driving his car in Lubbock, Texas, and police pulled him over and, knew that, the registration was for Jack Leffler, Bobby's half brother, and they began to question this person, and of course it came out that he had murdered him in the desert. They'd gotten drunk. The story never really was told, but they were supposedly target shooting and got into a fight. And this is a really a silly / tragic part of the story. Jack kept a stack of play money in the visor of his car, because there was a young boy who lived in the apartment complex where he was, and he would play with the kid and give him things. And sometimes he'd pull out a play $5 bill and give it to him. Well, apparently the guy who was with Jack in the desert saw this stash of what he thought was real money behind the visor, and they believe that's what led him to killing. So anyway, Mrs. Fuller was never the same after that. She had a nervous breakdown. There were several attempted suicides. Let me take you back to when they signed with Bob Keane, and to give you an idea of the kind of operation that Bob Keane ran, he signed them to a deal, but he did not have his own recording studio at that point. All of his equipment was antiquated. His equipment went back to the days of Ritchie Valens in the late 50s. So Bob Keane had taken on a new partner, which is an important part of the story here. And the partners, there were two of them. They funded the construction of a new recording studio there at Delphi. But in the meantime, there was no place for Bobby and the band to record. So they recorded here and there in Hollywood. They actually went to Phoenix and recorded some music there with Lee Hazelwood and Dwayne Eddy. Dwayne Eddy, of course, being the famous twangy guitar player. And they began to record music, but also Bob Keane, whatever his faults were, he was very good at getting them live work there in Hollywood. He connected them to Casey Kasem.
American Top 40.
This is Casey Kasem in Hollywood, and up to this point, we've heard 99 of the year's 100 biggest hits.
And Casey took a real liking to them and began to play their records on the air. They also were playing some of the better clubs in Hollywood. There was one in particular called PJ's, which was a really hot club at the time. It's where a lot of the stars would go. It was open, until 4 o'clock in the morning. They would serve breakfast. You'd have people like Steve McQueen and Lawrence Harvey coming in there in the early morning hours to eat breakfast. It apparently was, I've talked to a couple of the band members who played at PJ's. Dalton Powell was one. And by the way, I failed to mention here that Dalton Powell did not make the move to Hollywood immediately because he had a family and he wasn't sure that this was all going to pan out. So he remained in El Paso where he had a job. Bobby recruited another drummer named Dwayne Quirico. And Dwayne is the one that you hear drumming on most of the recordings for the Bobby Fuller Four that were made in Hollywood anyway. Dalton played on a lot of the drumming in the local El Paso recording studio stuff, but Dwayne was the one who really became the drummer for the short duration of the fame of the Bobby Fuller Four. And I've spoken to Dwayne. He's still alive. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and he's the thing about talking to these guys now. It's great for somebody like me who was a music fan from the '60s. They've got some of the greatest stories that you've ever heard, and they tell you stories about their contemporaries. Dwayne told me a story about being called in for an audition to become perhaps the drummer for the Turtles. He went there, and of course he didn't get the job, but that's when he went to work for Bobby. But he talks about playing gigs with these guys. They played in the Rose Bowl with Herman's Hermits and the Turtles, and they played with some of the hottest band, Dave Clark Five. You go back and you look at some of the dates that they played, and they were right on the verge of really becoming stars. And ironically, when they got hooked up with Bob Keane, he did not release I Fought the Law first. He saw other songs that he thought had more potential. And one thing that he and Bobby Fuller began to have butt heads over was simply that Bob Keane felt that Bobby was trying to become the next iteration of Buddy Holly. And if you listen to some of Bobby's music, you can hear some vocal similarities, but I think Bob Keane was being very unfair to Bobby, because if you listen to the music, some of the songs that he wrote, they sound nothing like anything that Buddy Holly would have done. And the production quality was much, much different. Buddy Holly's tracks were always very basic, just drummer, bass, and him on guitar. And whereas Bobby's productions were much more layered and elaborate, and I think much more professional. And I think that his recordings today stand up well with a lot of his contemporaries. But again, he was hooked up with a guy named Bob Keane, who knew nothing about how to really promote him as a recording artist. This is where it becomes it takes sort of a darker turn, if you will, that Bobby and the band, of course, were constantly badgering Keane. Hey, we want to be a national recording artist. We were regional recording artists in El Paso. Los Angeles is certainly a bigger pond than El Paso, but we still want to be big all over the country. And Keane just did not have the wherewithal to get him broken on a national level. This is where his partner, a fellow named Larry Nunes, enters the picture. Nunes was what they called a rack jobber, a record distributor. He would go into record stores, use a little muscle, if you will, to get the prime spot in a record store or a department store for his records to be displayed. He didn't mind using force, and he was said to be associated with the mob. He was also a very intimidating looking character, very dark featured. He was actually Portuguese, but he could pass for Italian, which in those days translated to mob. So Nunes was a partner and had bankrolled the signing of the Bobby Fuller Four, and he said, look, I've got friends on the East Coast that can help us break these guys, so let's book them on a tour of the United States. Of course, in those days, we're talking 1966, a national tour in those days for a small band like them meant traveling in a van, playing every iteration of venue that you can think of. One night they might be playing a college gymnasium to thousands of people. The next night they might be playing a dive bar to maybe 100 people. And the band traveled, zigzagged across the country, but they did end up in New York. They played a couple of really high-profile venues in New York. And in New York is where the mob really enters the picture here. There was a fellow named Morris Levy, who many of your listeners will recognize the name, because Levy was known as the godfather of American music. and they meant godfather in the sense of Vito Corleone type of godfather. Levy took a liking to Bobby, and he saw the potential for him to be a national artist. So he met with Bobby privately. He said, "Look, you're not going anywhere with Bob Keane. Let me take you over." There were meetings being held outside of the rest of the band's participation. That led to problems, as you might imagine, with the band. Of course, one of the band members was Bobby's brother, and he became very jealous of Bobby. There was always a jealousy undertone to the relationship with Bobby and Randy anyway. And so Bobby was beginning to make noises about going out on his own as a solo artist. Morris Levy was whispering in his ear, telling him, "I can make this happen for you." Larry Nunes was a partner. He was an associate of Morris Levy. So Bob Keane was slowly being left behind in the dust and probably didn't even realize it at that time. But by the time that the band left New York and continued their tour, the tension in the band had gotten to be pretty high. The other guys wanted to know, hey, why aren't we being included in some of the publicity and the promotions? And add on top of that, none of them were being paid. Bob Keane and Nunes back in Hollywood were just confiscating the money and not paying them any royalties for the recordings. Bobby and the band had to pull teeth to get money just to be paid to be out on the road. The tension and the friction between everybody in this picture was beginning to get off the chart.
The band sees this record, probably a 45, and you got the circle. And those people don't remember the old vinyl. You got the circle, and it goes around and around. At the top of the arc was Bobby Fuller, not the Bobby Fuller 4. And then underneath, like, what did it say? And before, or whatever it was. But they saw that. And now he might not have had anything, he asked for it or whatever. But boy, you see that, and it's like,
yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out because it's an important part of the story. When the band was first getting started with Bob Keane, their first record, a box came into the Delphi Studios one day, and Randy Fuller and Jim Reese, the guitarist, happened to be standing there. And of course, they were curious. This was their first release with a national record label, so they opened up the box, looked at it, and together, and it said, at the top of the label on the 45, it said Bobby Fuller. On the lower part, it said, "And the Fanatics," in very small print. And in fact, one of the anecdotes in the book is that Randy Fuller grabbed that 45, sailed it into Bob Keane's office as if it were a Frisbee, shattered it against the wall above Bob Keane's head, and this big argument ensued. Bobby arrived in the office shortly thereafter. They began to have a discussion about, hey, this was all supposed to be one for all and all for one when we came out here. What's this Bobby Fuller and the band stuff? So they had this big debate. They had a big argument, and the band was never happy about it, but that's when they became known as the Bobby Fuller 4. And it caused problems for the rest of the life of the band. They didn't like being pigeonholed as role players. They all thought that they were equal players in the band, and it just didn't work out that way, and it caused a lot of hard feelings.
And so going forward to where we were just before this, we were talking again about Morris Levy. So now this is again quite a bit later, well, a bit, but it's not contemporary to that story, that he's now, got the year and all that. So now they're even seeing more after, if they have memory of that original slight, if you will. Now he's hitching Mr. Levy, hitching his wagon to maybe Bobby alone, right?
Right. When they got to New York and they played some club dates there, they were very well received in the clubs. And of course, Larry Nunes, who was a partner in Delphi Records and an associate of Morris Levy in New York through the record rack jobbing business, Nunes had done a very good job of getting all the big people in the business to come out and hear the band play live. Suddenly now you've got people like Lou Adler and with Liberty Records. You had Ahmed Erdogan, the owner of Atlantic Records, was very interested. And these people all started to want to sign Bobby as a solo act. Well, Morris Levy, if you read the book, you'll see that he had quite a history of getting his way when it came to signing artists. There's an interesting anecdote in the book about how he ended up with Tommy James of Tommy James and the Shondells. Very interesting story that has some parallels to the Bobby Fuller story. Bobby was broke. They weren't being paid. And so Levy, and I think if you read the book, my theory is that this was all orchestrated to make Bobby vulnerable when he got to New York, that, hey, Morris Levy might look pretty good to me at this point because he's going to give me some money. He's making offers of making me he's going to have national distribution that we haven't had with Delphi. Bob Keane and Bobby always butted heads over the production of the records. Keane wanted them to sound one way. Bobby had his own vision of what he thought it should sound like. So when he got to New York and Morris Levy got his tentacles onto him, and they did call Morris Levy the octopus because he could just reach his hands into anything. And I need to point out here that Levy had the backing of the Genovese family, the mob family in New York. So if Levy wanted something, he typically got it because people didn't want to go head to head against Morris Levy and invoke the ire of the Genovese family. I think that's an important part of the story to bring up here. So when Bobby and the band finished their dates in New York and continued the tour, you had all of this animosity and acrimony that had just bubbled up through periods of time, starting with the name change, but then all of the publicity and the photographs even seemed to be just of Bobby Fuller, not the band. And of course, as you might imagine, they didn't care for that. So the last few weeks of that tour, as they slowly made their way west back toward Los Angeles, it was a really bad time. Bobby made it clear to the band that he was probably going to go solo. And when they got back to New York, the really sad part of this story to me is that while all these bad things were going on, the music was going very, very well. They had just hit the top 10 with I Fought the Law. They peaked at number 9, but they shared the top 10 for a couple of weeks with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Mamas and the Papas, Herman's Hermits. They had finally arrived as far as musically speaking, and a lot of the gloss came off of that simply because they weren't being paid. They were handled by an inept record label, and their star, Bobby, was being weaned away from the rest of the band, and it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, you might say, in the sense that the music was great, everything else sucked. And so when they got to Los Angeles, this would have been late June of 1966, and they had come off this tour, which I don't think by any means could have been called a success because they were broke the entire time they were on the road. They were driving around the country in this van that had no air conditioning. They were staying in cheap hotels. They weren't eating well. It was everything that a star tour would not be. And all of that just added to just the pressure on Bobby. Now, several interesting things happened when they arrived back in Los Angeles. Number one is their guitarist, Jim Reese, had his draft notice waiting for him in the mailbox. So, scratch one guitar player from the lineup. Dalton Powell, who had come back out and replaced Dwayne Quirico at that point, Bobby and Dwayne had issues, and Bobby finally fired him and replaced him with Dwayne. Dwayne came on out to California when he saw that they were having some success. He brought his family with him out to LA, and suddenly he felt pretty confident about, I'll join up with these guys now. I see that they're doing well. But Dwayne got tired of traveling. His wife didn't like living in Los Angeles. He moved his family back to El Paso, and he told Bobby that, hey, with this tour being over, I'm going to go back home. So the only person left in the band was his brother, Randy. And Randy was not sure if he still had a place in the band based on what Bobby had been telling him for the last several weeks about, hey, I'm going to go solo. And unbeknownst to Randy, Bobby was beginning to interview other people to be in his new band. He brought everything revolved around El Paso with these guys too, which is interesting to me. Bobby had two guys that he was going to put in the band to replace Dalton Powell and Jim Reese. They were both from El Paso, and they both happened to be in LA already working on their own, but not doing very well. They were working as session players and things like that. So Bobby had lined them up to come on and become new members of the band, and Randy did not know where he stood, which led some people to formulate a theory years later that Randy might have had a hand in killing his brother. You can read the book and determine your own opinion on that. But where I am in the story with you now is simply that they were back in LA. The band literally was falling apart. They thought that they were done touring, and Larry Nunes and Bob Keane told them, no, we've got one more gig. We're going to send you on a couple more gigs here on the West Coast. And the first one is in San Francisco. So they were very unhappy about going there, but they went, and they turned out they were playing this really, really ratty little club in Chinatown in San Francisco. And when they played the first night, there were about 12 people in the audience. And Bobby asked the manager of the club, how come there's nobody here? Did y'all promote this? And he said, yeah, we put some posters up here and there around in head shops and on telephone poles. But there was no radio advertising, nothing to speak of. And of course, San Francisco in 1966 was not exactly the market for the Bobby Fuller 4. You had Jefferson Airplane, Country Joe and the Fish, the Grateful Dead. People weren't really too interested. Bobby Fuller wasn't even really being played on the radio in San Francisco. So they played a second night with another very small crowd, and Bobby said, that's it, we're out of here. So they quit the gig. They were supposed to be there for 2 weeks. They drove back to Hollywood and told Nunes and Keane, we're not doing that. You know, it was just a terrible thing. It wasn't promoted well, and basically we quit. And that was the last club date that they played. They did play one more gig as a band for a Casey. They liked Casey Kasem, and Casey liked them. And their last gig was about a week before Bobby died at one of the Casey Kasem dances, and that was the last live gig for the Bobby Fuller 4. Where they were going to go from there was up to anybody's guess. Bobby was supposedly putting this band together. Whether Randy was going to be in it, Randy didn't know. It was still a very tense time, and Bobby began to just decompress, if you will, after all this time on the road. And they had an apartment in Hollywood on a street called North Sycamore, and it was just down the street from the old Grauman's Chinese Theater. It was a pretty nice neighborhood at the time. Today it's a dive. You've got to be careful when you drive through there, because you'll get panhandled. It truly is a mecca for the homeless. There's a hotel at the intersection where Bobby's apartment is where Janis Joplin died of an overdose a few years later. So that hotel today is a homeless center. So it's a rough neighborhood today, but in those days it wasn't so bad. And Bobby just spent most of the time hanging around the apartment there the last week of his life. I need to inject here that Bobby had a girlfriend in Hollywood, and her name was Melanie, and nobody really knew much about her, but I mentioned the club PJ's earlier. She worked out of PJ's as a call girl. She was also supposedly the girlfriend of somebody that owned one of the nightclubs there in Hollywood. But Larry Nunes, who owned Delphi Records, had paid Melanie to become Bobby's friend and become his spy, if you will, because he knew that Bobby was very unhappy. He knew that Bobby was complaining constantly about not getting paid. Nunes, of course, had mob connections, so he wasn't going to tolerate a lot of guff from, there's a Texas word for you, guff. He wasn't going to tolerate a lot of that from Bobby. So he hired Melanie to keep an eye on her and keep an eye on him and to report back to Nunes what Bobby was thinking and talking about and what was on his mind and what might be his next business move. And she did all of that. She reported back to him. After Bobby and the band had played that last Casey Kasem date, there was all kinds of friction between he and Nunes and Keene. For one thing, Keene advised him that they weren't going to be paid anything for the tour that they had just completed because they had eaten up all of their expenses with, eaten up all of the advance money with their expenses of traveling and lodging and all that stuff. So they just spent almost 3 months on the road for no pay, really no exposure, if you want to talk about it that way. It was a fiasco of a tour. So you had that tension beginning to build. Bobby had made it very clear that he had other offers coming in from other record labels, one being Morris Levy with Roulette Records in New York, another being Ahmet Erdogan with Atlantic in New York. And there was also talk that Columbia Records was interested in him at the time. So things were going well for Bobby personally. The band, not so much. But Bobby had always kind of seen himself as the star of the band anyway, going all the way back to the El Paso days. He had originally billed himself as the rock and roll king of the Southwest, never mentioning the band name. So he was clearly moving on from the Bobby Fuller Four that last week of his life. But Bobby had accepted some money from Morris Levy while he was in New York. Levy had given him an advance for the publishing rights to one of Bobby's songs called Let Her Dance. It was a single. It had really never done very well, but it was a very good record. And Levy, for all of his other criminal faults, was a very good ear for talent and knew that Let Her Dance was going to be a hit record if he promoted it and distributed it nationally. So he had given Bobby supposedly up to, the numbers vary. I heard from $10,000 to $50,000 for the rights to that one copyright. Bobby took the money because he needed it. But then he had these other record labels whispering in his ear that, hey, we'd like to sign you and we've got a better deal. He was particularly enamored of Ahmet Erdogan and Atlantic Records. And that's where I think he probably would have tried to sign had he lived. But however, that last week, the word began to circulate and it got back to Morris Levy that, hey, this kid is, he's not going to stay with you, Morris. He's talking to Erdogan over at Atlantic. And you'll have to read the book for a lot of the incidents in which Morris Levy's artists met either bad endings or were injured or their careers were ruined because they tried to bolt away from Roulette Records and Morris Levy.
We won't even mention, I'm being facetious, that his bodyguard, Levy's bodyguard, came to an untimely end. So again, it's all in the book. I don't want to, it could get, over, I want them to read the book, but the color, not evilness, but I'm sorry, the mobness of Mr. Levy can't be expressed.
Well, Morris Levy had a history of not taking the news well when his artists challenged him and asking for things such as royalties or money that was owed to them. He was just a cheapskate. And it was always odd to me as I put this book together. Why? Because the money was there, and I think it was just because he was mob-oriented in his thinking, And it was like, who do you think you are, kid, asking me for money, royalties? I'll give you. There are incidents about Tommy James asking for money, and Tommy James later claimed that he was owed up to, $20 or $30 million. And he did receive a settlement long after Morris Levy died. But there were other artists such as Jimmy Rogers, who was a big artist in the 50s and early 60s. He was beaten up on the freeway in Los Angeles and suffered severe brain injuries to the point that his career basically ended, all because he was asking Morris Levy for his royalty money. Levy had a real tendency to pick on a lot of the black R&B artists that he signed. A lot of them didn't have legal representation. A lot of them were not well educated. A lot of them just didn't know, what their contracts really entitled them to have. And when they would go and ask for money, there were instances of some of them ending up dead, some of them ending up just not in good health after it was over with. Morris had a bodyguard that would go out to record stores. If he got the word that somebody was bootlegging his records, he would send a fellow named Nate McCalla out to the record stores with a baseball bat. And Levy kept an umbrella stand full of baseball bats by his office door. So that's the kind of guy we're talking about in Morris Levy. So in his last few days of Bobby Fuller's life, even though he had accepted money for the copyright to one record, Bobby believed that that's all that he was in bed with Morris Levy with, was one song, Let Her Dance. Levy thought that he now owned Bobby Fuller. And so when he got wind that Bobby was talking about signing with other record labels, walking away from his deal with Delphi Records, he didn't take it very well. And he began to have people threaten Bobby, and Bobby just did not take the threats very seriously. Up until the last day of his life, there were people calling him from New York, telling him, you better not do this or something bad is going to happen to you. Bobby's mother was in the apartment there on the last weekend of his life, and she overheard some of these phone calls. The road manager for the band was also in the apartment and overheard some of these phone calls. And it reached the point that on the evening of July the 18th, 1966, Bobby got a phone call about 2 o'clock in the morning and told him, and no one knew why, but he left the apartment around 2, and he never came back. And his mother woke up that morning with another of her premonitions, similar to the one that she had had when her son Jack was killed several years earlier. She just knew that something bad had happened. She saw that the car was not out in the apartment parking lot. She asked the road manager to go downstairs that morning and look around, see if she could see the car, if he could see the car or any sign of Bobby. He did not. So all day goes by, and there was supposed to be a meeting that day with Bob Keane at Delphi Records to discuss the future of the band. That's what that discussion at the park had been about with Keane and Bobby the day before. And the band all shows up at Delphi's office for the meeting. Bobby doesn't show up, and everybody begins to think, well, this is a little strange because he's the one that really wants to end this agreement and get out of here. Why isn't he here? So they said, well, maybe something happened. We'll reschedule the meeting for this afternoon. Bobby doesn't show up in the afternoon. And so the band all says, well, maybe he's flaked out. Maybe he's with a girl. Maybe who knows what he's doing. But obviously he's not going to show up today. So they all just went home. As I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of musicians. There were a couple of musicians from El Paso that were talking to Bobby about joining his band. One was a drummer named Ty Grimes. The other was a guitarist named Mike Ciccarelli. They had been talking to Bobby about joining his new band. And so he had told them, hey, come by the apartment on Monday, July the 19th, and we'll talk about bring this band, and I'll tell you what my plans are. So they had shown up at the apartment 2 or 3 times already that day, Monday the 18th. and Bobby wasn't there. His mother was there, and she said, I don't know where he is. But they came back a couple more times, still no Bobby. So they showed up again about 5 o'clock that afternoon, and they parked the car in a dirt parking lot that was adjacent to the apartment complex. And they walked around to the stairway to go up to the apartments and knocked on the apartment door, and this time no one answered. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Fuller had gone downstairs to the mailbox to check the mail, and she had been looking for her car to come back all day long with her son in it, and of course he hadn't done it. So she walked around to this dirt parking lot where they sometimes park the car, and that's when she saw, it was a blue Oldsmobile that she saw parked in the lot this time, and there were 2 men standing by it wearing suits. And the driver's side door was open, and so she dropped the mail and she immediately ran over there. It was probably a distance of 50 feet or so. And these 2 men are standing by the car. One of them is holding a gasoline can in his hand. She sees her son in the front seat of the car, slumped over, lying down with his head beneath the steering wheel. And she doesn't know yet that he's dead, but she begins to scream, and she touches him and realizes that he's cold to the touch. He's in full rigor mortis. This fellow has already poured a bunch of gasoline over him and all over the car seat. She begins to just lose it and go screaming and hysterically. These 2 guys want to get her away from there as quickly as they can because there's no one else in the parking lot at that time. And I fully believe that their intention was to set that car on fire with Bobby in it. But she interrupted their plans, so they began to escort her back to the apartment. They're coming down the sidewalk when Ty Grimes and Mike Ciccarelli are coming back the other way after having knocked on her apartment door. They encounter her, and they see these 2 big guys, and Ty Grimes describes them as mob-looking guys. And they escorted her, the mob people escorted her back up the stairs to her apartment. Grimes sees the Oldsmobile, parked in the parking lot over there. And he goes over and he's the first other than Mrs. Fuller to see Bobby lying there in the car. And he obviously knows that he's dead. And so he and Ciccarelli stand there looking at it for a moment, and Ciccarelli kind of freaks out and says, let's get out of here. And Grimes wants to stick around, and he says, no, let's see what's going on. And they never saw the 2 mob guys again. The plan to burn the car had been interrupted, and they didn't see the 2 mob people leave, but they never showed up again, never were seen again. Ciccarelli and Grimes go up the stairs again to the apartment, and that's when this whole thing starts to fall apart. It's just, then the police show up, and the police began to immediately write this off as a suicide. By this time, a crowd has gathered around the car in the parking lot, and people are starting to murmur, and people know who this is. One of them made mention to one of the cops that that's Bobby Fuller. He's played clubs all over town. He's a big time musician. And the cops just said, okay, well, it's probably just another rock musician, rock and roller that decided to kill himself. Well, I don't know how you kill yourself when you're in rigor mortis and you pour fresh gasoline on top of yourself. The police never investigated this case, Jim. That's the most amazing thing of this entire story to me, is that Morris Levy had connections with police departments all over the country through the Genovese family. And it's my theory in the book that Morris Levy played a hand. I don't want to give away the entire ending here. You'll have to read the book to find out all of the facts, but I think I've set the stage here to let you know that there were any number of people who might have wanted to see Bobby Fuller dead, but I think only one had the real means to make it happen, being connected to the mob. And so Bobby was, his death was written off originally as a suicide. What no one knew at the time was there was a million life insurance policy on Bobby Fuller that had been taken out by Larry Nunes when Bobby signed his contract with Delphi. Now, that wasn't entirely unusual because a lot of record labels would sign and take out insurance policies on their artist just for the nature of the business, traveling, lifestyle, whatever. But this particular policy that had been taken out on Bobby by Nunes had a suicide clause in it, which said that if the person dies of suicide, they don't pay out. So it took about 6 weeks for the final autopsy to be released, but when it was released, it was no longer a suicide, it was accidental. Suddenly someone is eligible to receive insurance money. So you can draw your own conclusion about, was the $1 million insurance policy a motivation to kill Bobby Fuller? Well, the insurance policy was originally taken out by Larry Nunes. Because Nunes was an associate of Levy, and I believe I draw this trail pretty well in the book, the connections between Nunes and Levy. It's my theory that Levy made the call that, hey, this guy's getting to be more trouble than he's worth. You've got this insurance policy on him. You can split it with me. And Nunes had no standing to argue with a guy like Morris Levy, who was backed by the Genovese family. If Levy says he wants half of the insurance policy, or Levy may have taken the entire insurance policy for all I know. But
obviously, Mom got the best look at the two guys. Probably they're shuffling her all over the place, and the two new band members or prospective band members, they see the two guys maybe for a few seconds. It's broad daylight. 5:00, whatever, not in the middle of the night. And so even if the cops said, well, we don't want to talk to you about it or whatever, I don't know who they were, but maybe they were gawkers. But did their family go to the press and say, come on, we saw these people? Nowadays I've covered so many cases where the parents or the wife or the whatever, even in normal uncorrupt cops or DAs, it gets written off as someone else or whatever. They spend months or years, and 9 times out of 10, they get the right answer at the end. So I'm going to guess, or you can tell me or say it's in the end of the book, and I won't ask you to say it, but did this just die? Weeks later, months later, years later, did it just die? Pardon the pun.
Essentially, yes. But there was some effort made. The family knew, of course, that this was no suicide. They eventually hired a private investigator to look into it. The private investigator was told by the LA police, if you know what's good for you, you'll probably just stop looking into this. Which again, people hearing this may think, well, it's the LAPD. They're not gonna, they're not gonna be orchestrated by a member of the mob. But of course, we know that they can be and will be. Levy had more than one instance, and it's mentioned in the book about him working specifically with the LAPD to cover up for him on other beatings and things that he had authorized. So, yeah, the police, were they corrupt? I don't think there's any doubt about it. Were they told by Levy, you need to change this ruling to a murder? Or at least it was actually changed to accidental, which is even more stupid to me, because what is accidental about? Here's what you've got, Jim. You've got a case of a guy who disappears around 2 a.m. He's not seen for about another 13 hours. When he shows up in a car driven by 2 mob-looking guys, the witnesses said that there were scrapes on his arms and on his bodies, and that it looked like he'd been roughed up. He had one broken finger that was actually bent backwards. That was obvious to witnesses who were there in the afternoon standing around the car. So there's no question that he met a violent death through violent means, and they intended to burn the car. But the theory of a suicide is so ridiculous, because here's what you have. You have a guy who is in rigor mortis, who supposedly drove himself back to this place, doused himself in gasoline, and oh, by the way, I failed to mention this, there were no car keys found. So the people who drove in there took the keys with them. So you've got a dead man, dead for hours, long enough to be in rigor, and freshly soaked in gasoline, and no car keys. And this is a suicide in the eyes of the LAPD. But again, through someone's influence, it was changed to an accidental death, which made the insurance premium payable.
Now let's end on a slightly higher note. Oh, there's the book. He's holding it up for us. Yes. And I got the Bobby Fuller 4, or if you want to call them the Fanatics, or whatever you want to call them. But there they are. But I do want to point people, especially if they're my age. By the way, folks, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm old. Ron can speak for himself. But before we went on the air, I mentioned to him that this was my music, not necessarily that band, but everyone else we've been mentioning. I was in high school in the 60s, and the Beatles, we hit everyone with the coats. I don't know what they were called, but the collarless neighborhood jet, they all, I didn't get one. My parents wouldn't let me get one, but all the cool, and the haircuts, the cool kids had neighborhood jackets. And so that was my era. And again, I mentioned to Ron when we first started, at that time it was AM radio only. Now, this is even in my mind before FM, which of course came on and did its own, elevator music. So AM was it. You had the big DJs around the country. We had decent DJs in my hometown of Rochester, New York, one of which was Jessica Savage, who went on to be a big news person until she was killed, unfortunately, in a car crash. But she was on my local radio station, WBBF 950, and she was known as Honeybee. But so that was my era, and it was great music. It was, it was dance music. You'd go to, dances, but it was 45s, occasionally an album, but there was no, spinning things and running things off a computer. You had a turntable, and it was great. So that part of the book is worth its weight in gold. Then you get a murder case from it, which is, you can't, hey, 2 for 1, you can't beat that. So as we leave and run off into the sunset, is there anything you sort of want to toss in from this experience of researching? It was great. You got to talk to band members. So it's not just, going to, I hate the people go to Wikipedia and just rehash what's there. You did your work, and it shows. So again, what would you like to say in closing?
Well, it was a labor of love for me, I guess you would say, because I love writing true crime stories, but I also love that it's my music as well. I think I'm a couple of years older than you from what you described, but I was around when the Bobby Fuller 4 was on the radio, and the music, I just always wondered what would he have accomplished had he been around and kept going and been able to produce his own music uninterrupted by a schlep like Bob Keane. But it didn't happen. It's one of those, unfulfilled, stories. It's also a great mystery. I draw my own conclusions in the book, but who's to say that I'm exactly right? The story is 60 years old. In fact, we just are coming up on the anniversary of Bobby Fuller's death, July the 18th. So it's a long, long time ago, but I think the story is interesting enough that if somebody has not even heard of the Bobby Fuller 4, I think it's an interesting story. It tells a lot about what the music business was like in the 60s and how it could turn violent with the mob influence. Bobby Fuller was just an isolated case of a recalcitrant artist who wanted to push his masters a little too far.
But tell me, my folks, how they do. I forget how I got you. Is it a website? Is it a Facebook page? Is it an author page? Tell my folks where.
All above, I've got a website, ronsmith-books.com. Has got all my books links to take you to where you can buy them. They're available on Amazon, Kindle, Goodreads. You can find them on there. I'm working on expanding it and trying to get the market them a little bit more, but that's where you can find me.
I want to thank Ron Smith for spending an almost over an hour with us today. It's always fun when I like to just get it all out there. And it is so fascinating. Again, the book, He Fought the Mob. I get on a soapbox at the end and I say, if you have a brick and mortar store in your area, go there. They're not going to have it. They will get it for you, couple extra bucks, take you a couple of days, and you're helping a local business. I mean, I do Amazon, I have to. Sometimes a book is only available on Kindle, so I have to do that. But I try to support the local businesses.
Amen. And the deal that I alluded to is I'm hoping to get in with a major book retailer, brick and mortar store people sometime in the next few months. I'm working on that as we speak.
Now, let me ask you, I could have looked it up, but I don't think it is. Is this, you got any interest for a movie or, a made-for-TV streaming? Oh, he's nodding.
Not for this one yet. I'm hoping.
So once again, I want to thank you, Ron Smith, for being on Murder Most Foul.
Jim, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to doing another one with you sometime.
So I'd like to thank you folks for kindly tuning in for another episode of Murder Most Foul. If you liked what you heard, I hope you'll tell your friends. Information about the podcast and an email link that can get a message to me can be found at the podcast's website. The address being www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces, .com. So until we meet again, stay safe, and for God's sakes, don't murder anyone.